Good afternoon.
You just handed these out.
At this time, I will call to order the Flood Diversion Authority Board meeting for Thursday, November 21st, 2019. Roll call, please.
Mrs. Sherling?
Here.
Mr. Peterson? Mr. Steen?
Here.
Dr. Mahoney?
Aye.
Mr. Pepcorn? Mr. Grinberg?
Aye.
Mr. Judd?
Present.
Mr. Hendrickson?
Here.
Ms. Carlson? Here. Mr. Campbell?
Here.
Mr. Wayland? Mr. Thorsted?
Here.
Mr. Jacobson?
Here.
Welcome, everyone. We have the minutes of the previous meeting. Are there any corrections or additions or a motion to approve?
Move for approval. Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. The motion carries. On to item number 3, the agenda. There's an addition to the agenda, I understand.
Madam Chair, that'd be 9E, request from our Executive Director on administrative staffing.
Okay, anything else? Could I get a motion to approve the agenda with the change with the addition?
So moved. Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. And moving right along to the Executive Director's report. Mr. Paulson, welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome. We'll start with the program controls report. This is a high-level estimate of completion and overall cost to date. So I won't go through, again, I won't go through these in detail, but I have included them for your review. Total expenditures to date is $508 million. You can see forecast year budget 2019 in relation to cost to date for forecast year budget 2019. Again, same as last month, significantly below budget due to the slowdown with some of our legal issues. So. 2019 revenues, same slide. This is the last time you'll see this slide other than when we start talking about the forecast year 2020 budget. I'll have this slide to show where revenues are coming from for 2020. Oops. So again, here's our dashboard that I highlighted at the meeting last month. And so this dashboard is still in under construction, but it will be available to all the board members very soon. And in here we can see estimate to completion and overall cost to date. And again, we can drill down engineering, legal, financial, and we can see the different classifications in a level 2 analysis. I'll just click on another one and we can drill down again over here. So this is going to be available to you folks. We're almost complete with it. It's going to be very handy for everyone to be able to drill down and get the information they need for tracking budgets and budget preparation. So. Executive Director approved contracting items for the month. We had Task Order 1, Amendment 8, Phase 1 Cultural Resource Investigation. This was a closeout task order for a unencumbrance of $116,447 through AECOM. The second item was a service agreement modification for County Road 17 ditch cleaning, and that was an increase of $25,796. Cass County Joint Water Resource District approved contracting items for the last month. Task Order 5, Amendment 0, Property Acquisition Services. That was the task order for HMG for $660,000. And there were no approved contracting items for the Moorhead-Clay County Joint Powers. Some activities and achievements this past month. We had 2 design reviews that are underway. The Corps of Engineers segment, SE1, was submitted for 35% design review, and the I-29 roadways, 35% design review. We're preparing 3 projects for bidding at the moment: Hickson Main Avenue Storm Sewer Project, the Oxbow-Hickson Baki Wetland Mitigation Project, and a property structure mitigation package. Current projects still under construction: 2nd Street South and Main Avenue flood mitigation, that's been delayed. Oxbow-Hickson Pump Station, delayed final completion, and property structure mitigation Phase B substantially complete. Here's an aerial view of the 2nd Street flood mitigation project. Activities and achievements from last month: land acquisition and property mitigation, 6 parcels, parcel appraisals approved in the last month, 5 parcels acquired in the last month. The Cass County Joint Water Resource District has approved starting formal negotiations on 64 parcels. Updated the property status report with a split of the southern embankment and the upstream mitigation area by state. We developed farmland leases on project-owned lands for 2020. 3 of the 34 leases are secured. Continued attempts to secure rights of entry for the southern embankment design efforts, both in Minnesota and North Dakota. Continued attempts to secure environmental monitoring easements for the Corps' environmental monitoring plan. And Mr. Dodds will update the board on some of the progress related to that. So I'll turn it over. I think Mr. Dodds, did you want to do? Okay, all right, sounds good. So again, here's our map for the activities and achievements for the land acquisition. That's included in your packet. Some other notable things: we finished the Clomar outreach. So I did attend multiple council meetings and committee meetings over the last 2 months. A lot of great communication with folks. In general, there was support for the Clomar and the new flood insurance rate maps that would be related to that. As the board knows, we had the Assistant Secretary of the Army, R.D. James, visit. That was very positive. A lot of social media engagement on that. We also had a construction and animated flyover of the inlet control structure, and that had quite a few views, 1,000 views in October. In upcoming, I'll be presenting at the North Dakota Water Conference on December 5th under Projects on the Move, the larger projects in North Dakota, and I'll be able to highlight the successes that we've had this year with the Diversion Authority.
Sure.
Excuse me,
Yes.
Commissioner Steen.
Mr. Paulson, just a quick question. You may be getting to it, but you're on outreach there. Have we done anything with regard to reaching some type of publication agreement or alignment with some local newspapers?
So thank you, Commissioner Steen. We are working on that. We should have something prepared for next month that will start to circulate. My intent is to do an executive director note about the project, especially when we have items of significance. We've had quite a few of those this year, and so it'll be a chance for us to put information out, truthful information about what's happening with the project. We'll also address some of the misinformation about the project as well, and provide a format in the written media that I think will help clarify some of the issues. So it's in the works. So, yeah. So look ahead the next 3 months. I did present the 2020 budget to the Finance Committee yesterday. We anticipate bringing that to the full board in December. We'll be meeting with the state engineer tomorrow regarding permitting for the diversion channel. which is expected to be a very good meeting. We're going to get some more clarification on how we're going to permit the diversion channel construction and how that phased approval is going to look. As I mentioned before, we're presenting and also hosting a booth at the North Dakota Water Convention in December. We'll be attending the Business Leaders Task Force meeting. We'll be completing the NDSU Ag Impacts Study update to reflect Plan B. Anticipate FEMA's approval of the Clomar, which is going to be significant for us. With the approval of the Clomar and with the guidance that we've already received from the State Water Commission, we'll be able to package that together and start to work with impacted landowners upstream to determine mitigative measures on their properties. That's something we haven't been able to do before, and it's led to a lot of ambiguity, a lot of questions that impacted residents have, and we're going to be able to start to provide answers to some of those questions. Terry will mention this in a minute, but we expect the award of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers contract for the Wild Rice River Control Structure, hopefully within the next few weeks. We'll be continuing to secure the remaining rights of entry for the Southern Embankment work, both in North Dakota and Minnesota. Negotiate the scope for the Phase 2 flowage easement valuation. So we'll be making progress on the flowage easement front, and a couple other, finalize the most important one on here, finalize the development of the issuance of the P3 draft RFP. So that's expected end of December, early January. Look ahead 3 to 6 months out, we'll be holding one-on-one meetings with the P3 proposers as we work through that draft RFP. We'll support the contested case hearing as we move into closer to that date. We'll solidify the upstream structure mitigation requirements, as I had mentioned previously, and initiate bidding for the Hickson Main Avenue storm sewer and property structure mitigation. And I'll open it up for any questions the board may have.
Questions? Anyone have any? Paulson.
Thank you.
Item number 5, I see we have Terry here, Army Corps of Engineers project update. Terry Williams.
Afternoon, you should have one of these in your packet. The diversion inlet structure, the test piles were driven the week of 4 November and they're setting up right now. The load testing on those test piles should begin after Thanksgiving. That will tell us that the design we have for the H piles for the inlet structure, the capacity is sufficient. It's pretty typical to do these kind of tests on structures that are founded on clay type soils. Number 2, the Wild Rice River structure, as Mr. Paulson said, we still anticipate awarding that contract in November and likely prior to Thanksgiving. Number 3, the Red River structure design. The physical model down at Erdick and Vicksburg has been constructed and it's up and running. They're starting to run tests through it, so it's pretty exciting. On the back of this handout, you can see a couple of photos that were taken 2 days ago, and you can see how large this physical model is, and you can see the gates and the water running through the model. So we've got a lot of excited engineers back in our office that this thing is up and running. We're still on track to have a 35% design in February. Number 4, Southern Embankment. As Mr. Paulson said, the 35% design for the western tieback is with the sponsors for a 2-week review. We're still doing a lot of borings. Our New Orleans crew is out on the western tieback right now trying to locate and define the sand seam that runs through that high ridge out there. And our own crew, I believe, is in the Camel Hump area. So they'll be doing borings all winter into spring and summer of next year. The I-29 raised design, as Mr. Paulson said, that's going to be out for review as well. And we would award this contract in FY21 if it's funded. And then the final item, number 6, the cultural resources mitigation that we've been talking about going on the diversion channel. The field work is done, and the next steps include developing a report that goes to SHPO for a 30-day review. So with that, any questions?
Thank you. Questions? Commissioner Grinberg.
Just, if funded, that caught my attention.
If funded, so that's, the I-29 raise is a federal responsibility. The Corps of Engineers will be constructing that. And so we're asking that it be funded in FY21 so we can award it. That's something we've identified as a funding need for federal.
Is that, in the overall scheme of the plan, been noted and everyone's aware of that? So you're asking for funding sooner than later, or?
No, we've identified that within the last year.
How does that align with your budget, our budget, Congress's ability to pay? Is it,
Whether it's
what's the risk of it not being funded? Maybe that's a better way of asking the question.
I don't know what Congress will do, but yeah, there's always a risk that it won't be funded. But it's in our identified cost estimates for FY20. We put those together for FY20 and FY21. We included the I-29 work in that FY21 cost estimate.
Commissioner Peterson and then the mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Have you learned anything from our physical model? Any surprises?
No surprises yet. We had four of our folks there this week, and they were very happy with how the physical model is going, how it's been constructed. It's all working well. So now is when the testing starts. And the first big test result that we look for will happen in December, where we'll know that we've got enough capacity through the 350-foot gates. And we're fairly confident that that's the case.
Thank you.
Mayor Mahoney.
I think, Terry, what Commissioner Grinberg is asking, is it in the work plan? Because we get asked by Senator Hoven, is this in the work plan? So the raising of I-29 has been in the Corps' work plan.
It's in our request for FY21.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Any other questions? Thank you very much. And on to administrative legal. Mr. Shockley, you want to update us on the WIFIA timeline?
Thank you, Madam Chair. In your packet is just an update to the WIFIA timeline. My intent is to continue to provide you the board updates at every month's meeting so that you're just aware of the progress that's going on with respect to the WIFIA loan. We are intent on closing in January of 2021. That's the first item I have on the agenda. The second I have is just going over the flow of funds for the project. Yesterday I presented this in front of the Finance Committee. It is so the reason that I'm presenting this is the total project financing that's addressed in this flow chart is about $2 billion. And so given the significance of the amount of funds that are flowing through the authority, it's very important that I have concurrence from the board and from the member entities and some comfort level that how we're proposing to structure this transaction, the board is comfortable with that, as this structure moving forward will be the structure that we will go to WIFIA with, and it will also be the structure that we will work with the P3 developers as we work to close the project agreement. Sometimes I jokingly say P3 agreement is very much like a loan with some technical requirements bolted onto it. As you'll see in the chart, there's a lot of sophistication in how the funds flow. This chart addresses all of the non-federal funds. So the total project cost being about 2.75 billion, the 750 million coming from the federal share, and the remaining coming from the local share. And just briefly, I'll try to speed through this a little bit faster than I did yesterday at the Finance Committee meeting. Briefly, all the state of Minnesota funds will flow through a cost share agreement with Minnesota DNR to the MCC JPA project fund. The intent is that those funds would flow directly from the state of Minnesota into that entity, and then that entity will have the expenses related to Minnesota land acquisition coming out of it. The state of North Dakota appropriations, will be distributed into the Diversion Authority's revenue fund pursuant to the cost share agreements with the state of North Dakota. After every legislative session, there's a cost share agreement that's entered into between the state of North Dakota, the Diversion Authority, the city of Fargo, Cass County, and the Cass County Joint Board, and those funds have been going into the revenue fund. City of Fargo and Cass County have both pledged sales taxes. Those sales taxes are currently equal to 1.75% sales tax. Those all flow into the revenue fund. Those are treated as those items are treated as what we refer to as pledged revenues, meaning they're pledged into the revenue fund. The Cass County Joint Board, as you'll recall, the direction of this board has always been that special assessments would not be used as a source of revenue and only as a backup. And so that's why you'll see dotted lines. At the time, and I've used this as just an illustration, at the time of financial close, the Cass County Joint Board would issue a non-P3 warrant, and I've just used an estimated value of $350 million to be held as security. That's pledged into the revenue fund. And then a P3 warrant that is held as security for the P3 developers' investment in the project. Once again, those are not intended to be revenue sources, rather just security instruments. And finally, when a warrant is pledged, the Cass County deficiency levy is available if there is ever any non-payment. Once again, that would only occur if there was a failure of sales tax, a failure of Cass County and the city to not be able to use other funds, a failure of special assessments. It would sort of be the last ditch effort to make payments. On the maintenance side, there are two sources of maintenance, and we'll get into a third one in a little bit. There's the Cass County Joint Water Resource District Maintenance Levy and the Minnesota entities pursuant to the Joint Powers Agreement that form the Diversion Authority pledge stormwater fees. On the operations and maintenance side, those funds flow into an operations and maintenance fund that's held pursuant to the Joint Powers Agreement by the authority's fiscal agent. There are two sub-funds within that. There's a P3 O&M fund and a non-P3 and O&M fund. Later on, you'll see there is some importance to those. What happens after the funds get into the revenue fund? During construction, there's a difference between construction and after construction. During construction, those funds will flow into the annual budget, which the executive director is working on with the finance committee. They'll first be used to pay operating costs, and then during construction, any required debt service on temporary financing that's issued to get the project completed, or bridge financing between state appropriations. Any remaining funds of sales tax flow into the revenue FM project fund. Those are used pay as you go. And then at the end of every year, if there's funds left over, those are treated as net revenues. After construction, very similar, operating costs, keeping the lights on, paying the executive director, paying staff. Anything left over after that is considered net revenues. These funds have already been created pursuant to the Joint Powers Agreement, so there's no action needed there. But what happens next is during operations and maintenance, after construction is done, operations and maintenance costs related to the non-P3 elements would flow into the operating fund. And now we get into how do you pay your debt obligations. So we're introducing a new concept here that's referred to as the debt obligation indenture of trust that's going to be managed by a trustee. The Bank of North Dakota has tentatively agreed to serve as the trustee. We use a trust indenture when we have a very sophisticated transaction that requires a lot of different repayment of different sources. And so it's very critical that if you have questions, why are we doing this? Just tell me that you don't want to do this so we can restructure it. But it's really important to have everybody on the same page that this is how we're going to undertake the financing of the project. So during construction, any of the required debt service would flow to the trustee, and that will pay any of the temporary debt that would currently be the Wells Fargo loans or other temporary debt that's taken on. And then also any net revenues that are left after every year, those get swept into the trust indenture. After construction, all of the net revenues get sent over to the trustee. This happens on a monthly basis, so every month after operating costs are paid, it gets swept into the trust indenture. And then the trustee every month will make the WIFIA payments. They're on top of the water full of funds, so those get paid out first, and those only occur after construction. Remember, the WIFIA loan, the repayments don't start until 5 years after substantial completion of the project. WIFIA requires to be at the top of the waterfall because they have such favorable financing terms. They want to be first in priority. Then we'll have a couple of small SRF loans. Those SRF loans would be second in priority after the WIFIA loans. Third, we have a P3 fund. From the P3 fund, we're pledging the P3 warrant, what I talked about before, so that warrant's just held by the trustee as security. And then any of the P3 O&M costs are also pledged into that P3 fund, to which they'll make payments that are due under the project agreement. Recall that once you receive bids on your P3 transaction, you'll receive a two-part bid. One part will include what your milestone payments are during construction. That'll be equal to between 40 to 60% of the total construction costs. So just in rough numbers, we'll say 600 million in total construction costs from milestone payments, with the remaining 400 million that would be repaid after construction is over. And so after construction is over, the trustee is making the P3 fund, using the P3 fund to make the project agreement payments. From that, any reserve requirements would need to be met every month. That includes any IRS rebates or any requirements under the IRS code. Any payments of refunding improvement bonds, if those were ever issued, we have the ability to utilize the lower cost of capital because all of the work the Cass County Joint Board did. We have that ability. We can utilize that, issue bonds, and use the sales tax revenues to pay those. All of those funds, whether it's the temporary financing, the loan funds, the SRF loan funds, or the refunding improvement bond fund, they're all loan proceeds, and they all get tracked into the FM diversion fund to be used during construction. And finally, the trustee will utilize, if there's any excess funds left in the waterfall, those flow into the excess fund account, and then they flow back to the excess revenue fund account with the authority. Those funds are then diverted into the operations and maintenance fund. So this was the policy that was driven by the authority, that we want to use sales tax revenues to make capital payments and operations and maintenance payments. So that's really the first source of payment for operations and maintenance. And then any excess revenues left after those payments go back in the revenue fund, and we start the circle all over again. And this occurs on a monthly basis. So I can stop and answer any questions you might have about it. I will be going to each of the member entities and just going over this in January, and intend to bring forward what are referred to as pledge resolutions by each of the member entities. Those are listed in the green, just setting up this transaction. So there will be member entity action. There's no action today, but I wanted to make sure that everybody was comfortable with what we're proposing as we really start to get into the application, the WIFIA, and going to market, so to speak, with the P3.
Thank you. So what would be an alternate flow here if you didn't use the trustee?
Well, if you didn't use a trustee, it would be a service that would have to be undertaken by the fiscal agent. One of the issues that we identified coming out of the last legislative session was a concern about ring fencing funds to make sure to give confidence to the P3 developers that payments would be made. And so the trustee idea was really a due out from that. And so it gives confidence to the P3 market And it also, it's fairly cost-effective. We're gonna, after we get the trust indenture put together, we'll have an estimate of fees from the trustee, but the trustee will manage, make sure that all the payments are made every month. On top of that, they'll make sure that any of the IRS rebate requirements are satisfied, any of the calculations due under the IRS code are satisfied, and really be responsible for that. And under the trust indenture, it's like any trustee, they have a fiduciary duty to everybody involved. And so I've utilized the Bank of North Dakota several times in very sophisticated transactions. They do a great job at a relatively low cost, and the market has responded positively to them.
Thank you. Other questions? Does anyone have any other questions?
Just wanted to say one other issue. As you're considering moving forward with the project, the WIFIA post-closing activities, once we close on the loan, I think it's important to remember the reporting requirements. So after the date of closing, there'll be ongoing reporting requirements. So we'll have construction progress reports. Those are typically due quarterly. There'll be annual financial statements and an annual financial pro forma or model that's required to WIFIA to keep them updated. Interestingly, they have a site visit, so soon after closing in 2021, we would expect representatives from the EPA to be here to visit the site. Really what they want to do is make sure that their funds are being used for what we said they would be used for. So it's very critical to have a lot of tracking and identify color of money. So that's why we spent this time developing this chart, and then the PMC has also been developing how do we trace the color of money once that all ends up in the project fund. Then they'll come back for an ongoing visit once every year after closing. We do also have requirements to verify the construction progress, and then there'll be a federal compliance audit that's due for the American Iron and Steel and disadvantaged business and the Davis-Bacon requirements. So there's a lot of reporting requirements that will be required. What do you get in exchange for all these reporting requirements? If you would close on the WIFIA loan program this month, your interest rate would vary depending upon the day, anywhere from 2.3% interest to 2.5% interest. And so you get some very powerful capital at very low cost.
Thank you. Well, it certainly is an impressive display. Look forward to hearing more details. And when do you have to have this in?
The application for WIFIA, so we've already submitted our letter of intent and we are invited to apply. And the application process is really an application for a credit subsidy. So you've met approval for the loan. Now it's to go through the underwriting process, and that's due in February. After February is done, we will be engaged in negotiations and working through the loan documents with US EPA WIFIA. The loan could potentially close sooner than January, but because the project is so technical and it's went through so many different reviews, we wanted to give ourselves some extra time. That leads nicely into item C, the resolution. Last month I came before the board asking to get approval for the application fee and then also for the fees that WIFIA would incur as they process their loan application. The credit application fee is about $100,000. WIFIA fees for their professional services, so they get our application in, they'll start processing, doing their underwriting, and they have some additional fees that range anywhere from $300,000 to $400,000. So we can anticipate about a $500,000 application fee from WIFIA. The resolution that I've included authorizes myself as bond counsel to negotiate out all those agreements following the format that I've laid out, and then also to go ahead, submit the application along with the technical teams, the financial teams, and just to basically get the work done. Normally, we wouldn't go to this level of detail on authorizing resolution. However, given the size of the transaction, we want to do everything by the book so that people, as they watch the transaction, they can see the specific authorizations as we go through each one.
Thank you. So you're looking for approval today of this resolution.
Correct.
Questions or motion? Commissioner Peterson?
So moved, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Schirling?
Yes.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Steen?
Yes.
Dr. Mahoney?
Aye.
Mr. Grinberg?
Aye.
Mr. Judd?
Aye.
Mr. Hendrickson?
Aye.
Ms. Carlson?
Yes.
Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
Mr. Thorsted?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Thank you, and the motion is approved. So we will look forward to seeing you at the Cass County Commission meeting sometime in December?
First meeting.
Okay, great, thank you. Next on the agenda is public outreach. I know Commissioner Campbell chaired that yesterday. I see Mr. Schneider is here to give a report.
Right.
Hi, I'm Rocky Schneider with the PMC. Give an update on our public outreach. Commissioner Steen asked a question that was a really good one. We've been working with Joel and Chairman Roger Olson, who's not here today, but we've been working on a number of different ideas and how to really bring these ideas forward. I think one of the things we identified in the past is when we have an idea, it goes to the committee, and then it either gets worked on or it doesn't. What we're trying to do is come up with a new communications plan. We have one that's several years old, and so over the next quarter of 2020, we'll be updating the communications plan so we have new objectives and goals and sort of match the vision of the project as it enters the implementation phase, so that any of these ideas that come forward or responses that we need to have in the public can run through a process. And does this meet the goals? Does this meet the objectives of the plan? And so until that plan gets finalized and comes before this board, we'll maybe do it through Joel, but hopefully once we have a plan, some of those stuff will be a little more process oriented. And so we're looking forward to working on that communications plan. The committee talked about a number of different focus groups to do through that process as well, which include a number of you and committee leadership and community leaders as well. Another idea that Roger Olson had was to utilize postcards as maybe a public survey of not just outreach, but of the project. Where are you getting information? Are you getting enough? Are you getting too much? And try to figure out how we can target better and who we need to target and who's actually interested or maybe who's not interested in finding out information. But that's what the committee's primary goal is going to be over the next couple months, is to work on that plan and give their input involved in that. Also have a video to show, and of course one of the things we're entering the implementation phase is how do we make sure people understand the construction that's going on. I think as construction moves from in town and more visible to areas outside of town where it's maybe not as visible to the masses, you can be easy to be lost in the shuffle that is stuff going on. I think the question we get most often is this ever going to be built? And right now the Corps is working on a roughly $50 million, not a small project, and they're about to award another, similarly scaled one in the coming weeks. And so we want to make sure people understand that the project is moving forward, construction's happening. So just a short, minute 47 seconds here of your time to look at the current work going on at the inlet. This was shot, I think, last week. So you're really looking right down the channel of the project, right? Where the dam structure meets the start of the channel. Timed that pickup perfectly so you can see the scale of the project. I know one of the things Joel has talked about and we're excited to work on is how do we make the rest of the project more real? You know, you have these animated flyovers that were talked about earlier that people really seem to gobble up, both in town here in Washington DC at the Corps headquarters and our P3 bidders as well. It's a good way to keep track of what's going on with the project. But one thing Joel's talked about is how do we make those more realistic, understanding what's coming, you know, with the design that Terry showed earlier. You know, how do we put that in a visual way that people can see before it's constructed so they understand, you know, what's going to be done, to what scale. So we're working on that as well.
Questions for Rocky?
I was going to bring a complicated flow chart, but I decided Shockley probably tested the limits of that, so I'll stick with the video.
I think your music was enough, Mr. Schneider.
Thank you very much.
No, it's very cool. Thank you. Anyone reporting for the Business Leaders Task Force this month? Okay, then we'll move on to item number 8, land management. We met yesterday. You have in your packet the acquisitions and where we're at. I'll let, and we've got an amendment to our policy for voluntary acquisitions we want to go through, but I will have Mr. Dodds present, please.
Hi, good afternoon. Eric Dodds with PMC. First, maybe I'd just draw your attention, item 8B on the report is in your packet. It's the property status report. Very similar to what you've seen in the past, although I would point out just a few items for you. On the second page of that report, you see a map showing the overall acquisition status by location. Again, we continue to have a handful of parcels acquired each month, and so we continue to make some progress. We also have the bulk of the channel south of I-94 is shaded blue on the map. That means we are in negotiations. Many of those negotiations have reached the point where we've started what's called formal negotiations. That's one of the steps in the 12-step process following North Dakota Century Code. So some property owners are going to be receiving letters indicating that we're starting formal negotiations. Those letters come from the Cass County Joint Board. I think I just wanted to alert everybody's attention that those letters are going out, and sometimes these letters may not appear to be as friendly as we would like the negotiations to be, but that's kind of the status of where negotiations are at, and this is, again, sort of part of the recipe that we're following. A few other things I guess I would point out for you. Several pages back, you'll see in this report, this month we have split the southern embankment into its parts. Previously, it was all shown as one big lump for the southern embankment. Now, on page 7 of 10 of the report, if you'll notice, the southern embankment is broken down into 6 different components. 4 of those components are on the North Dakota side, 2 of them are on the Minnesota side. Next month, we will be making sure that the legend map identifies where those reaches are. They generally start on the west side with reach number 1 and move to the east with reach number 5 being the portion on the Clay County-Wilkin County line. And then on pages 8 and 10, I would also just point out for your information, we have split the upstream mitigation area into both North Dakota and Minnesota. Page 8 shows the flowage easements necessary on parcels in Minnesota, and page 9 shows the parcels that are needed in North Dakota. You'll notice that these parcel counts are labeled as approximate. We are continuing to work with FEMA as well as the state permitting agencies to hone in on the exact impacts and the mitigation requirements that will dictate the number of parcels. So those are the items I wanted to share with you on the status report. Unless there are questions, I'll jump into this acquisition program for voluntary sale of property.
Any questions on the property status report?
Seeing none, I guess I'll move forward here. Last month, as you recall, we had quite a good discussion about the auction that occurred down by the Oxbow area. There were 10 parcels that were auctioned off. 3 of them were within the Oxbow ring levy and 7 of them were outside of the ring levy. As you might recall, we have an interest in property rights on the 7 that were outside of the ring levy. The board elected to not pursue bidding on those, primarily because we did not have a clear policy on whether we should or should not be engaging in those types of sales. In front of you, I did lay out a one-page document. It is front back. The one side is a red line version of the policy that was part of the existing mitigation plan. The other page is a clean version of the same information. But I did want to show you the red lines that we are proposing for amendment to that policy. And so I'll just maybe summarize this. So on the heading, acquisition program for voluntary sale of property, previously this was titled the early property acquisition program. So this clarifies exactly that we're proposing a program for sale of property that is being sold by the property owner. A little bit further down in the bullet points there, you'll notice that we are proposing to periodically notify impacted property owners, making sure they are aware that their property rights will be needed for the project. And this year alone, we've sent our 2 notifications to these property owners. There were some previous notifications last year as well. Moving on down, the third bullet that's all in red letters or red text, you'll see there that this is an addition. Talks about if the property owners are choosing to sell their property via public sale or auction, then the PMC will notify and make a recommendation to the acquiring entity, whether that's the Cass County Joint Board or the MCC-JPA, as well as the executive director, regarding the need for property rights. The thought behind this is that the Diversion Authority has pretty clearly assigned the role for acquiring property to the Cass County Joint Board in North Dakota and the MCCJ Board in Minnesota. And so following suit with those actions, this is the suggested policy. And then the recommendation that we would be making would be based on a variety of factors. The last red text on that page points out that those factors may include what are the property rights that are needed for the project, whether we need fee title, whether we need just an easement or something else, the location of the property, if the property is, again, impacted by construction, perhaps it's in the staging area needed for operations, is it in the deeper part, in the shallow part, what is the timing of the property right needs, if we need some property rights in the near term, next year or 2, or if it's 4, 5, 6 years away. And then what is the type of property, whether there's some structures, whether it's just farmland, or whether there's potential building sites that are being sold. All those factors will weigh into the recommendation that we would make to those acquiring entities. The Land Committee did review this yesterday. They made a few suggestions. Those suggestions are incorporated into what you have in front of you. And I think the motion from the Land Committee, Commissioner Campbell made the motion, was to approve this amendment to the policy of the mitigation plan for acquisition program for voluntary sale of property. That recommendation was brought forward, or is being brought forward to the Diversion Board for consideration.
Questions? Mayor?
Eric, yesterday there was a radio program, and they obviously sold some land south of Fargo, and the question was, does the project harm the value or the appraised value of the land? And the radio announcer did not know our policy on that. So the policy of us, as I understand it, is more of what is the true appraised value of the land, and we do pay that value if it's harmed by the project. If, for instance, I think some of the land sold for $4,000, if really the value appraised is more like $6,000, that we would be paying a higher price. Is that correct?
Yeah, maybe 2 comments on that. First off, on the appraisal side, every parcel of land that we buy would generally have an appraisal done. And that appraisal is done on market conditions without influence from the project. And so that means that the project cannot either devalue or inflate the value of the property that we need to buy for the project. That's requirements of the federal program. And so all the appraisals that we've been doing, the appraisers have to take that into account. They're all credentialed appraisals to do that work properly. The second thing I would point out, and I did hear some of that radio discussion as well, and obviously it's been a real tough year, in fact several years, to be a farmer. And so the allegation was perhaps that the project itself was the sole cause of devaluing that land. Obviously, the farm economy is could be in better condition. And, we heard this news about Crystal Sugar recently and, beet prices and other things. And so all of those factors weigh into what is land value worth. Generally speaking, I think we've seen no inflation of land values since we started several years ago, probably a softening of land values generally across the area. I think we would also see that prime farmland has generally held its value pretty well, but if you get just a nidge off of the prime farmland, then you'll see values starting to decline. And so that's really the job of the appraisers, to assess all of that information and come up with their valuation opinion.
Other questions? Or a motion?
Motion to accept.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobson.
Second.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Sherling?
Yes.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Steen?
Yes.
Dr. Mahoney?
Aye.
Mr. Grinberg?
Aye.
Mr. Judd?
Aye.
Mr. Hendrickson? Ms. Carlson?
Yes.
Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
Mr. Thorsted?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
The motion carries. Thank you. On to item 9, finance. Mr. Grinberg.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple other points adding to Joel's Executive Director report. Item 9A shows you our expenditures cumulative total. We've now crossed over 500 million, as reported earlier as well, at 508 million. Looking on page 2, 91.4 million in net cash position. And then before you is the rest of the detail. Happy to answer any questions, but I'd move for acceptance of the financial report.
So moved.
Second.
Any further discussion or questions on the finance report? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Sherling?
Yes.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Steen?
Yes.
Dr. Mahoney? Mr. Grinberg?
Aye.
Mr. Judd?
Aye.
Mr. Hendrickson? Ms. Carlson?
Yes.
Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
Mr. Thorsted?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
And the motion carries.
Madam Chair, item 9B, before you are requests for payments to Cass County Joint Water Resource District, Dorsey and Whitney, Onstead and Twitchell, and Cass County, for a total of $2,557,869.69. I would move for approval.
Move to approve.
Second. Any questions or discussion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Sherling?
Yes.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Steen?
Yes.
Dr. Mahoney? Mr. Grinberg?
Aye.
Mr. Judd?
Aye.
Mr. Hendrickson? Ms. Carlson?
Yes.
Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
Mr. Thorsted?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Thank you. And on to the cash budget for 2020.
In your packet is a draft of FY20 cash budget for your review. Next month, the Finance Committee will go into deeper detail and bring a recommendation for the DA Board meeting in December for final approval for 2020. So consider this as information or background for your interest to dig deeper. I don't know if, Joel, you want to talk about, there's a website with more information yet in detail, or where they can access that?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Greenberg. If there's any questions as you look through the 2020 cash budget draft, please reach out to my office and we can take a dive into any sort of questions that you might have. It is a large amount of information, as you can imagine, so I'm here to answer any questions that you might have as you review that. The Finance Committee will, as Commissioner Grinberg mentioned, take a deeper dive into that in December and hopefully have a recommendation to the board at the December meeting.
9D, Joel, you want to?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Grinberg. So I handed out for your information, it's according to the JPA, one of my requirements is to create an organizational structure for the administration of the Diversion Authority. I have come up with a draft organizational chart and a draft organizational budget for the Diversion Authority administration. And this is also included in the forecast year 2020 draft budget as well, when you're looking at your numbers under program management. I've indicated a few different level 1 areas where I've calculated my budget. And really today, I'm asking for the authority to advertise a couple positions related to my organizational chart. It's indicated, it's been indicated to many people around me that we need to hire a couple additional staff as quick as possible to get things up to speed. So I'm making a proposal here. If you review the organizational structure, the boxes in blue are the proposed new staffing positions related to the organizational chart. I asked the board if they so choose to allow me to advertise the position for an executive administrative assistant and advertise the position for the assistant executive director. So I can work on that, hopefully hold interviews end of December, January timeframe, try to get some of those positions filled right away in 2020. So.
Questions? Or a motion?
Move for approval. I'll second.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Roll call, please.
Madam Chair, may I ask what the motion is? Is it to approve the org chart, or is it to approve him moving forward with his 2 hires?
2 hires.
2 hires.
Okay, thank you.
Correct? Mayor Judd?
I'll keep my second.
Mrs. Sherling?
Yes.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Dr. Mahoney? Mr. Grinberg?
Aye.
Mr. Judd?
Aye.
Ms. Carlson?
Yes.
Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
Mr. Thorsted?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
And do we still have a quorum?
I was just counting, yes.
Okay.
Madam Chair, we do need to do 9D.
Yes, I was just gonna,
Yes.
we jumped over that. I just want to make sure before we do it that nobody leaves. Okay. Recommended contracting actions.
So the recommended contracting action before you is Task Order 31, Amendment 0 for permit compliance monitoring. That's an HMG task order for $184,639. That is above the $150,000 level for executive director approval, and I'm recommending approval to the board today.
Madam Chair, yesterday we did approve this at Finance, so I move for approval.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any questions or discussion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Sherling?
Yes.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinberg?
Aye.
Mr. Judd?
Aye.
Ms. Carlson? Yes. Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
Mr. Thorsted?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Great, thank you. And on to item 10A, other business gifts and hospitality policy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At the very back of your packet is the last item, the gift and hospitality plan. As we have filled the executive director position and we move to fill additional positions, the need to have employee and personnel policies is paramount. Before you is the gift policy. This does apply to board members and diversion administrative staff, as well as consultants working on the project. And so I present this draft policy for your consideration today.
Thank you. Questions, members? Commissioner Peterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Maybe this is the time to broach this issue. Is it time to create a full policy manual? If so, could you just take Cass County's or the City of Fargo or City of Clay's, just cannibalize the entire thing and say this is the policy for the Diversion Authority in its entirety, rather than going piecemeal?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Commissioner Peterson. That is my intent, is to work off of the Cass County Employee Manual. Excuse me. I'll go through it to mark up any projected changes. Make
It's
those
perfect, though.
What's that? Yeah, well, I'm sure it is perfect. So if there is any changes, I'll
Like a
bring them.
typo of some kind, like a period or comma?
Yeah,
Semicolon?
I'm talking about administrative changes, yes, of course.
Is that right, Mayor Judd? It's perfect, I think.
I have not had a chance to review.
That's hurtful.
And Commissioner Peterson, that also includes paid gray and step program for the diversion authority as we bring additional staff on. I'll also be reviewing Fargo's and Cass County's program as far as class comp to narrow in on appropriate salary, wages, and benefits as well. So that work will be ongoing in anticipation of bringing staff on board in 2020. So I more than likely won't have anything before you until January time period. So,
Thank you.
yep.
Thank you. Any other questions or motion?
So moved.
Thank you.
Second?
Any further discussion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Schirling?
Yes.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinberg?
Aye.
Mr. Judd?
Aye.
Ms. Carlson?
Yes.
Mr. Campbell?
Yes.
Mr. Thorsted?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
And the motion carries. Is there any other business?
None.
Next meeting is December 19th, and I would accept a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
We are adjourned. Thank you all.